Well then, Glaucon, we've agreed to the following. If a city is to achieve the height of good government, wives must be in common, children and all their education must be in common, their way of life, whether in peace or war, must be in common, and their kings must be those among them who have proved to be the best, both in philosophy and in warfare. We have agreed to that, he said. Moreover, we also agreed that as soon as the rulers are established, they will lead the soldiers and settle them in the kind of dwellings we described, which were in no way private but common to all. And we also agreed, if you remember, what kind of possessions they will have. I remember we thought none of them should acquire any of the things that other rulers now do, but that, as athletes of war and guardians, they should receive their yearly upkeep from the other citizens as a wage for their guardianship and look after themselves and the rest of the city. That's right. But since we have completed this discussion, let's recall the point at which we began the discussion that brought us here, so that we continue in the same path from where we left off. That isn't difficult, for much the same as now, you were talking as if you had completed the description of the city. You said that you would class both the city you described and the man who is like it as good, even though, as it seemed, you had a still finer city and man to tell us about. But in any case, you said that if this city was the right one, the others were faulty. You said, if I remember, that there were four types of constitution remaining that are worth discussing, each with faults that we should observe, and we should do the same for the people who are like them. Our aim was to observe them all, agree which man is best and which worst, and then determine whether the best is happiest and the worst most wretched, or whether it's otherwise. I was asking you which four constitutions you had in mind when Polemarchus and Adeimantus interrupted. And that's when you took up the discussion that led here. That's absolutely right. Well, then, like a wrestler, give me the same hold again. And when I ask the same question, try to give the answer you were about to give before, if I can. I'd at least like to hear what four constitutions you meant. That won't be difficult since they're the ones for which we have names. First, there's the constitution praised by most people, namely the Cretan or Laconian. Second, which is also second in the praise it receives, is called oligarchy and is filled with a host of evils. The next, in order and antagonistic to it, is democracy, and finally there is genuine tyranny, surpassing all of them, the fourth and last of the diseased cities. Or can you think of another type of constitution? I mean, another whose form is distinct from these. Dynasties and purchased kingships and other constitutions of that sort, which one finds no less among the barbarians than among the Greeks, are somewhat intermediate between these four. At any event, many strange ones are indeed talked about. And do you realize that of necessity there are as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions? Or do you think that the constitutions are born from oak or rock and not from the character of the people who live in the cities governed by them, which tip the scales, so to speak, and drag the rest along with them? No, I don't believe they come from anywhere else. Then, if they are five forms of city, there must also be five forms of the individual soul. Of course. Now we've already described the one that's like aristocracy, for which is rightly said to be good and just. We have. Then mustn't we next go through the inferior ones, namely the victory loving and honor loving, which corresponds to the Laconian form of constitution, followed by the oligarchic, the democratic, and the tyrannical, so that having discovered the most unjust of all, we can oppose him to the most just. In this way, we complete our investigation into how pure justice and pure injustice stand with regard to the happiness or wretchedness of those who possess them, and either be persuaded by Thrasymachus to practice injustice, or by the argument that is now coming, to light to practice justice. That's absolutely what we have to do. Then, just as we began by looking for the virtues of character in a constitution, before looking for them in the individual, thinking they'd be clearer in the former, should we first examine the honor-loving constitution? I don't know what other name there is for it, but it should be called either a tymocracy or tymarchy. Then, shouldn't we examine an individual who's related to that constitution, and after that, oligarchy and an oligarch person, and democracy and a democratic person? And finally, having come to a city under a tyrant and having examined it, shouldn't we look into a tyrannical soul, trying in this way to become adequate judges of the topic we propose to ourselves? That would be a reasonable way for us to go about observing and judging at any rate. Well then, let's try to explain how democracy emerges from aristocracy. Or is it a simple principle that the cause of change in any constitution is civil war breaking out within the ruling group itself, but that if this group, however small it is, remains of one mind, the constitution cannot be changed? Yes, that's right. How then, Glaucon, will our city be changed? How will civil war rise, either between the auxiliaries and the rulers, or within either group? Or do you want us to be like Homer and pray to the Muses to tell us how civil war first broke out? And shall we say that they speak to us in tragic tones, as if they were in earnest, playing and jesting with us as if we were children? What will they say? Something like this: It is hard for a city composed in this way to change, but everything that comes into being must decay. Not even a constitution such as this will last forever. It too must face dissolution. And this is how it will be dissolved. All plants that grow in the earth, and also all animals that grow upon it, have periods of fruitfulness and barrenness of both soul and body, as often as the revolutions complete the circumferences of their circles. These circumferences are short for the short lived, and the opposite for their opposites. Now, the people you have educated to be leaders in your city, even though they are wise, still won't, through calculation together with sense perception, hit upon the fertility and barrenness of the human species, but it will escape them, so that they will at some time beget children when they ought not to do so. For the birth of a divine creature, there is a cycle comprehended by a perfect number. For a human being, it is the first number in which are found root and square increases, comprehending three lengths and four terms, of elements that make things like and unlike, that cause them to increase and decrease, and that render all things mutually agreeable and rational in their relations to one another. One of these elements, 4 and 3, married with 5, give two harmonies when thrice increased. One of them is a square, so many times 100. The other is of equal length one way, but oblong. One of its sides is 100 squares of the rational diameter of 5, diminished by each one, or 100 squares of the irrational diameter, diminished by 2 each. The other side is 100 cubes of 3. The whole geometrical number controls better and worse births. And when your rulers, through ignorance of these births, join brides and grooms at the wrong time, the children will be neither good natured nor fortunate. The older generation will choose the best of these children, but they are unworthy nevertheless, and when they acquire their father's powers, they will begin, as guardians, to neglect us muses. First, they will have less consideration for music and poetry than they ought. Then they will neglect physical training, so that your young people will become less well educated in music and poetry. Hence, rulers chosen from among them won't be able to guard well the testing of the golden, silver, bronze, and iron races, which are Hesiod's and your own. The intermixing of iron with silver and bronze with gold that results will engender lack of likeness and unharmonious inequality. And these always breed war and hostility whenever they arise. Civil war, we declare, is always and everywhere of this lineage, and will declare that what the muses say is right. It must be, since they're muses. What do the muses say after that? Once civil war breaks out, both the iron and bronze types pull the constitution towards money making and the acquisition of land, houses, gold, and silver, while both the gold and silver types, not being poor but by nature rich or rich in their souls, lead the constitution towards virtue and the old order. And thus, striving and struggling with one another, they compromise on a middle way. They distribute the land and houses as private property, enslave and hold as serfs and servants those whom they've previously guarded as free friends and providers of upkeep, and occupy themselves with war and with guarding against those whom they've enslaved. I think this is the way this transformation begins. Then isn't this constitution a sort of midpoint between aristocracy and oligarchy? Absolutely. Then, if that's its place in the transformation, how will it be managed after the change? Isn't it obvious that it will imitate the aristocratic constitution in some respects and oligarchy in others, since it's between them, and that it will also have some features of its own? That's right. The rulers will be respected, the fighting class will be prevented from taking part in farming, manual labor, or other ways of making money. It will eat communally and devote itself to physical training and training for war, and in all such ways, won't the Constitution be like the aristocratic one? Yes. On the other hand, it will be afraid to appoint wise people as rulers, on the grounds that they are no longer simple and earnest but mixed, and will incline towards spirited and simpler people who are more naturally suited for war than peace. It will value the tricks and stratagems of war and spend all its time making war. Aren't most of these qualities peculiar to it? Yes. Such people will desire money just as those in oligarchies do, passionately adoring gold and silver in secret. They will possess private treasuries and storehouses where they can keep it hidden and have houses to enclose them, like private nests where they can spend lavishly either on women or on anyone else they wish. That's absolutely true. They'll be mean with their own money since they value it and are not allowed to acquire it openly, but they'll love to spend other people's because of their appetites. They'll enjoy their pleasures in secret, running away from the law like boys from their father, for since they've neglected the true muse, that of discussion and philosophy, and have valued physical training more than music and poetry, they haven't been educated by persuasion but by force. The Constitution you're discussing is certainly a mixture of good and bad. Yes, it is mixed, but because of the predominance of the spirited element, one thing alone is most manifest in it, namely, the love of victory and the love of honor. Very much so. This, then, is the way this Constitution would come into being and what it would be like, for, after all, we're only sketching the shape of the Constitution in theory, we're not giving an exact account of it, since even from a sketch we'll be able to discern the most just and the most unjust person. And besides, it would be an intolerably long task to describe every constitution and every character without omitting any detail. That's right. Then who is the man that corresponds to this constitution? How does he come to be, and what sort of man is he? I think, said Edemontus, that he'd be very much like Glaucon here, as far as the love of victory is concerned. In that respect, I said, he might be, but in the following ones, I don't think his nature would be similar. Which ones? He'd be more obstinate and less well trained in music and poetry, though he's a lover of it, and he'd listen to speeches and arguments, though he's by no means a rhetorician, a rhetorician. He'd be harsh to his slaves rather than merely looking down on them as an adequately educated person does. He'd be gentle to free people and very obedient to rules, being himself a lover of ruling and a lover of honor. However, he doesn't base his claim to rule on his ability as a speaker or anything like that, but as he's a lover of physical training and a lover of hunting, on his abilities and exploits in warfare and warlike activities. Yes, that's the character that corresponds to this constitution. Wouldn't such a person despise money when he's young, but love it more and more as he grows older, because he shares in the money-loving nature and isn't pure in his attitude to virtue? And isn't that because he lacks the best of guardians? What guardian is that? Adeimantus said. Reason, I said, mixed with music and poetry, for it alone dwells within the person who possesses it as the lifelong preserver of his virtue. Well put. That, then, is a timocratic youth. He resembles the corresponding city. Absolutely. And he comes into being in some such way as this. He's the son of a good father who lives in a city that isn't well governed, who avoids honors, offices, lawsuits, and all such meddling in other people's affairs, and who is even willing to be put at a disadvantage in order to avoid trouble. Then how does he come to be timocratic? Well, he listens first to his mother complaining that her husband isn't one of the rulers and that she's at a disadvantage among the other women as a result. Then she sees that she's not very concerned about money and that he doesn't fight back when he's insulted, whether in private or in public in the courts, but is indifferent to everything of that sort. She also sees him concentrating his mind on his own thoughts, neither honoring nor dishonoring her overmuch. Angered by all this, she tells her son that her father is unmanly, too easygoing, and all the other things that women repeat over and over again in such cases. Yes, Adeimantus said, it's like them to have many such complaints. You know, too, I said, that the servants of men like that, the ones who are thought to be well disposed to the family, also say similar things to the son in private. When they see the father failing to prosecute someone who owes him money or has wronged him in some other way, they urge the son to take revenge on all such people when he grows up and to be more of a man than his father. The boy hears and sees the same kind of things when he goes out. Those in the city who do their own work are called fools and held to be of little account, while those who meddle in other people's affairs are honored and praised. The young man hears and sees all this, but he also listens to what his father says, observes what he does from close at hand, and compares his way of living with those of the others. So he's pulled by both. His father nourishes the rational part of his soul and makes it grow. The others nourish the spirited and appetitive parts. Because he isn't a bad man by nature, but keeps bad company, when he's pulled in these two ways, he settles in the middle and surrenders the rule over himself to the middle part, the victory-loving and spirited part, and he becomes a proud and honor-loving man. I certainly think that you've given a full account of how this sort of man comes to be. Then we now have the second constitution and the second man. We have. Then shall we next talk, as Aeschylus says, of another man ordered like another city, or shall we follow our plan and talk about the city first? We must follow our plan. And I suppose that the one that comes after the present constitution is oligarchy. And what kind of constitution would you call oligarchy? The constitution based on a property assessment in which the rich rule and the poor man has no share in ruling. I understand. So mustn't we first explain how tymocracy is transformed into oligarchy? Yes. And surely the manner of this transformation is clear even to the blind. What is it like? The treasure house filled with gold, which each possesses, destroys the constitution. First, they find ways of spending money for themselves, then they stretch the laws relating to this, then they and their wives disobey the laws altogether. They would do that. As one person sees another doing this and emulates him, they make the majority of the others like themselves. They do. From there, they proceed further into money making, and the more they value it, the less they value virtue. Or aren't virtue and wealth so opposed that if they were set on a scales, they'd always incline in opposite directions? That's right. So when wealth and the wealthy are valued or honored in a city, virtue and good people are valued less. Clearly. And what is valued is always practiced, and what isn't valued is neglected. That's right. Then in the end, victory loving and honor loving men become lovers of making money or money lovers, and they praise and admire wealthy people and appoint them as rulers, while they dishonor poor ones. Certainly. Then don't they pass a law that is characteristic of an oligarchy constitution, one that establishes a wealth qualification, higher where the constitution is more oligarchic, less where it's less so, and proclaim that those whose property doesn't reach the stated amount aren't qualified to rule? And they either put this through by force of arms, or else, before it comes to that, they terrorize the people and establish their constitution that way. Isn't that so? Of course it is. Generally speaking, then, that's the way this kind of constitution is established. Yes, but what is its character, and what are the faults we said it contained? First of all, the very thing that defines it is one, for what would happen if someone were to choose the captain of ships by their wealth, refusing to entrust the ship to a poor person, even if he was a better captain? They would make a poor voyage of it. And isn't the same true of the rule of anything else whatsoever? I suppose so. Except a city, or does it also apply to a city? To it most of all, since it's the most difficult and most important kind of rule. That, then, is one major fault in oligarchy, apparently. And what about this second fault? Is it any smaller than the other? What fault? That of necessity, it isn't one city, but two, one of the poor and one of the rich, living in the same place and always plotting against one another. By God, that's just as big a fault as the first. And the following is hardly a fine quality either, namely, that oligarchs probably aren't able to fight a war, for they be compelled either to arm and use the majority, and have so much more to fear from them than the enemy, or not to use them and show up as true oligarchs, few in number on the battlefield. At the same time, they be unwilling to pay mercenaries because of their love of money. That certainly isn't a fine quality either. And what about the meddling in other people's affairs that we condemned before? Under this constitution, won't the same people be farmers, moneymakers, and soldiers simultaneously? And do you think it's right for things to be that way? Not at all. Now let's see whether this constitution is the first to admit the greatest of all evils. Which one is that? Allowing someone to sell all his possessions and someone else to buy them, and then allowing the ones who sold them to go on living in the city, while belonging to none of its parts, for he's neither a moneymaker, a craftsman, a member of the cavalry, or a hoplite, but a poor person without means. It is the first to allow that. At any rate, this sort of thing is not forbidden in oligarchies. If it were, some of their citizens wouldn't be excessively rich, while others are totally impoverished. That's right. Now think about this. When the person who sells all his possessions was rich and spending his money, was he of any greater use to the city in the ways you've just mentioned than when he'd spent it all? Or did he merely seem to be one of the rulers of the city, while in truth he was neither ruler nor subject there, but only a squanderer of his property? That's right, he seemed to be a part of the city, but he was nothing but a squanderer. Should we say, then, that as a drone exists in a cell and is an affliction to the hive, so this person is a drone in the house and affliction to the city? That's certainly right, Socrates. Hasn't the god made all the winged drones stingless, Adeimantus, as well as some wingless ones, while the other wingless ones have dangerous stings? And don't the stingless ones continue as beggars into old age, while those with stings become what we call evildoers? That's absolutely true. Clearly, then, in any city where you see beggars, there are thieves, pickpockets, temple robbers, and all such evildoers hidden. That is clear. What about oligarchic cities? Don't you see beggars in them? Almost everyone except the rulers is a beggar there. Then mustn't we suppose that they also include many evildoers with stings, whom the rulers carefully keep in check by force? We certainly must. And shall we say that the presence of such people is the result of lack of education, bad rearing, and a bad constitutional arrangement? We shall. This, then, or something like it, is the oligarchic city. It contains all these evils and probably others in addition. That's pretty well what it's like. Then, let's take it that we've disposed of the constitution called oligarchy, I mean the one that gets its rulers on the basis of a property assessment, and examine the man who is like it, both how he comes to be and what sort of man he is. All right. Doesn't the transformation from a tymocrat we described to an oligarch occur mostly in this way? Which way? The tymocrat's son at first emulates his father and follows in his footsteps. Then he suddenly sees him crashing against the city like a ship against a reef, spilling out all his possessions, even his life. He had held a generalship or some other high office, was brought to court by false witnesses, and was either put to death or exiled, or was disenfranchised and had all his property confiscated. That's quite likely. The son sees all this, suffers from it, loses his property, and fearing for his life, immediately drives from the throne in his own soul the honor-loving and spirited part that ruled there. Humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to making money, and little by little, saving and working, he amasses property. Don't you think that this person would establish his appetitive and money-making part on the throne, setting it up as a great king within himself, adorning it with golden tiaras and collars, and girding it with Persian swords? I do. He makes the rational and spirited parts sit on the ground beneath appetite, one on either side, reducing them to slaves. He won't allow the first to reason about or examine anything except how a little money can be made into great wealth. And he won't allow the second to value or admire anything but wealth and wealthy people, or to have any ambition other than the acquisition of wealth, or whatever might contribute to getting it. There is no other transformation of a young man who is an honor lover into one who is a money lover that's as swift and sure as this. Then isn't this an oligarchic man? Surely he developed out of a man who resembled the constitution from when oligarchy came. Then let's consider whether he resembles the oligarchic constitution. All right. Doesn't he resemble it in the first place by attaching the greatest importance to money? Of course. And further, by being a thrifty worker who satisfies only his necessary appetites, makes no other expenditures, and enslaves his other desires as vain? That's right. A somewhat squalid fellow who makes a profit from everything and hoards it, the sort the majority admires. Isn't this the man who resembles such a constitution? That's my opinion, anyway. At any rate, money is valued above everything by both the city and the man. I don't suppose that such a man pays any attention to education. Not in my view, for if he did, he wouldn't have chosen a blind leader for his chorus and honored him most. Good, but consider this. Won't we say that because of his lack of education, the dronish appetites, some beggarly and others evil, exist in him, but they're forcibly held in check by his carefulness? Certainly. Do you know where we should look to see the evil doings of such people? Where? To the guardianship of orphans or something like that, where they have ample opportunity to do injustice with impunity. True. And doesn't this make it clear that in those other contractual obligations, where he has had a good reputation and is thought to be just, he's forcibly holding his other evil appetites in check by means of some decent part of himself? He holds them in check, not by persuading them that it's better not to act on them or taming them with arguments, but by compulsion and fear, trembling for his other possessions. That's right. And by God, you'll find that most of them have appetites akin to those of the drone once they have other people's money to spend. You certainly will. Then someone like that won't be entirely free from internal civil war and wouldn't be one but in some way two, though generally his better desires are in control of his worse. That's right. For this reason, he'd be more respectable than many, but the true virtue of a single-minded and harmonious soul far escapes him. I suppose so. Further, this thrifty man is a poor individual contestant for victory in a city, or for any other fine and much honored thing, for he's not willing to spend money for the sake of a fine reputation, or on contests for such things. He's afraid to arouse his appetites for spending, or to call on them as allies to obtain victory, so he fights like an oligarch with only a few of his resources. Hence, he's mostly defeated but remains rich. That's right. Then we have any further doubt that a thrifty moneymaker is like an oligarchic city? None at all. It seems then that we must consider next democracy, how it comes into being, and what character it has when it does, so that, knowing in turn the character of a man who resembles it, we can present him for judgment. That would be quite consistent with what we've been doing. Well, isn't the city changed from an oligarchy to a democracy in some such way as this? Because of its insatiable desire to attain what it has set before itself as the good, namely, the need to become as rich as possible? In what way? Since those who rule in the city do so because they own a lot, I suppose they're unwilling to enact laws to prevent young people who've had no discipline from spending and wasting their wealth, so that by making loans to them secured by young people's property, and then calling those loans in, they themselves become even richer and more honored. That's their favorite thing to do. So, isn't it clear by now that it is impossible for a city to honor wealth and at the same time for its citizens to acquire moderation, but one or the other is inevitably neglected? That's pretty clear. Because of this neglect and because they encourage bad discipline, oligarchies not infrequently reduce people of no common stamp to poverty. That's right. And these people sit idle in the city, I suppose, with their stings and weapons, some in debt, some disenfranchised, some both, hating those who've acquired their property, plotting against them and others, and longing for a revolution. They do. The money makers, on the other hand, with their eyes on the ground, pretend not to see these people, and by lending money, they disable any of the remainder who resist, exact as interest many times the principal sum, and so create a considerable number of drones and beggars in the city. A considerable number indeed. In any case, they are unwilling to quench this kind of evil as it flares up in the city, either in the way we mentioned, by preventing people from doing what they like with their own property, or by another law which would also solve the problem. What law? The second best one, which compels the citizens to care about virtue by prescribing that the majority of voluntary contracts be entered into at the lender's own risk, for lenders would be less shameless than in their pursuit of money in the city, and fewer of those evils we were mentioning just now would develop. Far fewer. But as it is, for all these reasons, the rulers in the city treat their subjects in the way we described. But as for themselves and their children, don't make their young fond of luxury, inescapable of effort, either mental or physical, too soft to stand up to pleasures or pains, and idle besides, of course. And don't they themselves neglect everything except making money, caring no more for virtue than the poor do? Yes. But when rulers and their subjects in this condition meet on a journey or some other common undertaking, it might be a festival, an embassy, or a campaign, and they might be shipmates or fellow soldiers, and see one another in danger, in these circumstances the poor in any way despised by the rich? Or rather, isn't it often the case that a poor man, lean and suntanned, stands in battle next to a rich man, reared in the shade and carrying a lot of excess flesh, and see him panting and at a loss? And don't you think that he consider it through the cowardice of the poor that such people are rich, and that one more poor man would say to another when they meet in private, "These people are at our mercy. They're good for nothing. I know very well what they would do." Then, as a sick body needs only a slight shock from outside to become ill, and is sometimes at civil war with itself even without this, so a city in the same condition needs only a small pretext, such as one bringing in allies from an oligarchy or the other from a democracy, to fall ill and fight with itself, and is sometimes in a state of civil war without any external influence. Absolutely. And I suppose that democracy comes about when the poor are victorious, killing some of their opponents and expelling others, and giving the rest an equal share in ruling under the Constitution, and for the most part assigning people to positions of rule by lot. Yes, that's how democracy is established, whether by force of arms or because those on the opposing side are frightened into exile. Then how do these people live? What sort of constitution do they have? It's clear that a man who is like it will be democratic. That is clear. First of all, then, aren't they free? And isn't the city full of freedom and freedom of speech? And doesn't everyone in it have the license to do what he wants? That's what they say, at any rate. And where people have this license, it's clear to them that each of them will arrange his own life in whatever manner pleases him. It is. Then I suppose that it's most of all under this constitution that one finds people of all varieties. Of course. Then it looks as though this is the finest or most beautiful of the constitutions, for like a coat embroidered with every kind of ornament, this city, embroidered with every kind of character type, would seem to be the most beautiful. And many people would probably judge it to be so, as women and children do when they see something multicolored. They certainly would. It's also a convenient place to look for a constitution. Why is that? because it contains all kinds of constitutions on account of the license it gives its citizens. So it looks as though anyone who wants to put a city in order, as we were doing, should probably go to a democracy as to a supermarket of constitutions, pick out whatever pleases him, and establish that. He probably wouldn't be at a loss for models at any rate. In this city, there's no requirement to rule, even if you're capable of it, or again to be ruled if you don't want to be, or to be at war when the others are, or at peace unless you happen to want it. And there is no requirement in the least that you not serve in public office as a juror if you happen to want to serve, even if there's a law forbidding you to do so. Isn't that a divine and pleasant life while it lasts? It probably is, while it lasts. And what about the calm of some of their condemned criminals? Isn't that a sign of sophistication? Or have you never seen people who've been condemned to death or exile under such a constitution stay on at the center of things, strolling around like the ghosts of dead heroes without anyone staring at them or giving them a thought? Yes, I've seen it a lot. And what about the city's tolerance? Isn't it so completely lacking in small-mindedness that it utterly despises the things we took so seriously when we were founding our city? Namely, that unless someone had transcendent natural gifts, he'd never become good unless he played the right games and followed a fine way of life from early childhood. Isn't it magnificent the way it tramples all this underfoot by giving no thought to what someone was doing before he entered public life and by honoring him only if he tells them that he wishes the majority well? Yes, it's altogether splendid. Then these and others like them are the characteristics of democracy, and it would seem to be a pleasant constitution which lacks rulers but not variety, and which distributes a sort of equality to both equals and unequals alike. We certainly know what you mean. Consider, then, what private individual resembles it. Or should we first inquire, as we did with the city, how he comes to be? Yes, we should. Well, doesn't it happen like this? Wouldn't the son of that thrifty oligarch be brought up in his father's ways? Of course. Then he too rules his spendthrift pleasures by force, the ones that aren't money-making and are called unnecessary? Clearly. But, so as not to discuss this in the dark, do you want us first to define which desires are necessary and which aren't? I do. Aren't those we can't desist from and those from whose satisfaction benefits us rightly called necessary? For we are by nature compelled to satisfy them both. Isn't that so? Of course. We'd be right to apply the term necessary to them. We would. And what about those that someone could get rid of if he practiced from youth on, those whose presence leads to no good or even to the opposite? If we said that all of them were unnecessary, would we be right? We would. Let's pick an example of each so that we can grasp the patterns they exhibit. We should do that. Aren't the following desires necessary? The desire to eat to the point of health and well-being, and the desire for bread and delicacies? I suppose so. The desire for bread is necessary on both counts. It's beneficial unless it's satisfied, we die. Yes. The desire for delicacies is also necessary to the extent that it's beneficial to well-being. Absolutely. And what about the desire that goes beyond these and seeks other sorts of foods that most people can get rid of if it's restrained and educated while they're young, and that's harmful both to the body and to the reason and moderation of the soul? Wouldn't it be rightly called unnecessary? It would indeed. Then wouldn't we also say that such desires are spendthrift, while the earlier ones are money-making because they profit our various projects? Certainly. And won't we say the same about the desire for sex and about other desires? Yes. And didn't we say the person we just now called a drone is full of such pleasures and desires, since he is ruled by the unnecessary ones, while a thrifty oligarch is ruled by his necessary desires? We certainly did. Let's go back then and explain how the democratic man develops out of the oligarchic one. It would seem to me as though it mostly happens as follows. How? When a young man who is reared in the miserly and uneducated manner we described tastes the honey of the drones and associates with wild and dangerous creatures who can provide every variety of multicolored pleasure in every sort of way, this, as you might suppose, is the beginning of his transformation from having an oligarchic constitution within him to having a democratic one. It's inevitable that this is how it starts. And just as the city changed when one party received help from like-minded people outside, doesn't the young man change when one party of desires receives help from external desires that are akin to them and of the same form? Absolutely. And if I suppose that, if any contrary help comes to the oligarchic party without him, whether from his father or from the rest of his household, who exhort and reproach him, then there's civil war and counter-revolution within him, and he battles against himself. That's right. Sometimes the Democratic Party yields to the oligarchic, so that some of the young man's appetites are overcome, others are expelled, a kind of shame rises in his soul, and order is restored. That does sometimes happen. But I suppose that, as desires are expelled, others are akin to them are being nurtured unawares, and because of his father's ignorance about how to bring them up, they grow numerous and strong. That's what tends to happen. These desires draw him back into the same bad company, and in secret intercourse breed a multitude of others. Certainly. And seeing the citadel of the young man's soul empty of knowledge, fine ways of living and words of truth, which are the best watchmen and guardians of the thoughts of those men whom the gods love, they finally occupy that citadel themselves. They certainly do. And in the absence of these guardians, false and boastful words and beliefs rush up and occupy this part of it. Indeed, they do. Won't he then return to these lotus eaters and live with them openly? And if some help comes to the thrifty part of his soul from his household, won't these boastful words close the gates of the royal wall within him to prevent these allies from entering and refuse even to receive the words of older private individuals as ambassadors? Doing battle and controlling things themselves, won't they call reverence foolishness and moderation cowardice, abusing them and casting them out beyond the frontiers like disenfranchised exiles? And won't they persuade the young man that measured and orderly expenditure is boorish and mean, and joining with many useless desires, won't they expel it across the border? They certainly will. Having thus emptied and purged these from the soul of the one they're possessed, and initiated in splendid rites, they proceed to return insolence, anarchy, extravagance, and shamelessness from exile in a blaze of torchlight, wreathing them in garlands and accompanying them with a vast chorus of followers. They praise the returning exiles and give them fine names, calling insolence good breeding, anarchy freedom, extravagance magnificence, and shamelessness courage. Isn't it in some such way as this that someone who is young changes, after being brought up with necessary desires, to the liberation and release of useless and unnecessary pleasures? Yes, that's clearly the way it happens. And I suppose that after he spends as much money, effort, and time on unnecessary pleasures as unnecessary ones, if he's lucky and with his frenzy doesn't go too far, when he grows older and the great tumult within him has spent itself, he welcomes back some of the exiles, ceases to surrender himself completely to the newcomers, and puts his pleasures on an equal footing. And so he lives, always surrendering rule over himself to whichever desire comes along, as if it were chosen by lot. And when that is satisfied, he surrenders the rule to another, not disdaining any, but satisfying them all equally. That's right. And he doesn't admit any word of truth into the guardhouse, for if someone tells him that some pleasures belong to fine and good desires, and others to evil ones, that he must pursue and value the former, and restrain and enslave the latter. He denies all this, and declares that all pleasures are equal and must be valued equally. That's just what someone in that condition would do. And so he lives on, yielding day by day to the desire at hand. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to the flute. At other times he drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training. At other times he's idle and neglects everything. And sometimes he even occupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. He often engages in politics, leaping up from his seat and saying and doing whatever comes into his mind. If he happens to admire soldiers, he's carried in that direction, if moneymakers, in that one. There's neither order nor necessity in his life, but he calls it pleasant, free, and blessedly happy, and he follows it for as long as he lives. You perfectly describe the life of a man who believes in legal equality. I also suppose that he's a complex man, full of all sorts of characters, fine and multicolored, just like the democratic city, and that many men and women might envy his life, since it contains the most models of constitutions and ways of living. That's right. Then shall we set this man beside democracy as one who is rightly called democratic? Let's do so. The finest constitution and the finest man remain for us to discuss, namely, tyranny and a tyrannical man. They certainly do. Come then, how does tyranny come into being? It's fairly clear that it evolves from democracy. It is. And doesn't it evolve from democracy in much the same way that democracy does from oligarchy? What way is that? The good that oligarchy puts before itself, and because of which it is established, is wealth, isn't it? Yes. And its insatiable desire for wealth and its neglect of other things for the sake of money-making is what destroyed it, isn't it? That's true. And isn't democracy's insatiable desire for what it defines as the good also what destroys it? What do you think it defines as the good? Freedom. Surely you'd hear a democratic city say that this is the finest thing it has, though the result is it is the only city worth living in for someone who is by nature free. Yes, you often hear that. Then, as I was about to say, doesn't the insatiable desire for freedom and the neglect of other things change this constitution and put it in need of a dictatorship? In what way? I suppose that when a democratic city, a thirst for freedom, happens to get bad cupbearers for its leaders, so that it gets drunk by drinking more than it should of the unmixed wine of freedom, then, unless the rulers are very pliable and provide plenty of that freedom, they are punished by the city and being accused oligarchs. Yes, that is what it does. It insults those who obey the rulers as willing slaves and good for nothings, and praises and honors, both in public and private, rulers who behave like subjects and subjects who behave like rulers. And isn't it inevitable that freedom should go to all lengths in such a city? Of course. It makes its way into private households and in the end breeds anarchy even among the animals. What do you mean? I mean that a father accustoms himself to behave like a child and fear his sons, while the son behaves like a father, feeling neither shame nor fear in front of its parents in order to be free. A resident alien or a foreign visitor is made equal to a citizen, and he is their equal. Yes, that is what happens. It does. And so do other little things of the same sort. A teacher in such a community is afraid of his students and flatters them, while the students despise their teachers or tutors. And in general, the young imitate their elders and compete with them in word and deed, while the old stoop to the level of the young and are full of play and pleasantry, imitating the young for fear of appearing disagreeable and authoritarian. Absolutely. The utmost freedom for the majority is reached in such a city when bought slaves, both male and female, are no less free than those who bought them. And I almost forgot to mention the extent of the legal equality of men and women and of the freedom in the relations between them. What about the animals? Are we, Aeschylus, going to say whenever it was that came to our lips just now about them? Certainly. I put it this way. No one who hasn't experienced it would believe how much freer domestic animals are in a democratic city than anywhere else. As the proverb says, dogs become like their mistresses, horses and donkeys are accustomed to roam freely and proudly along the streets, bumping into anyone who doesn't get out of their way, and all the rest are equally full of freedom. You're telling me what I already know. I've often experienced that sort of thing while traveling in the country. To sum up, do you notice how all these things together make the citizen's souls so sensitive that if anyone puts upon himself the least degree of slavery, they become angry and cannot endure it? And in the end, as you know, they take no notice of the laws, whether written or unwritten, in order to avoid having any master at all. I certainly do. This, then, is the fine and impetuous origin from which tyranny seems to me to evolve. It is certainly impetuous, but what comes next? The same disease that developed in oligarchy and destroyed it also develops here, but it is more widespread and virulent because of the general permissiveness, and it eventually enslaves democracy. In fact, excessive action in one direction usually sets up a reaction in the opposite direction. That happens in seasons, in plants, in bodies, and, last but not least, in constitutions. That's to be expected. Extreme freedom can't be expected to lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether for a private individual or for a city. No, it can't. Then I don't suppose that tyranny evolves from any constitution other than democracy. The most severe and cruel slavery from the utmost freedom. Yes, that's reasonable. But I don't think that was your question. You asked what was the disease that developed in oligarchy and also in democracy, enslaving it. That's true. And what I had in mind as an answer was that this class of idle and extravagant men, whose bravest members are leaders and the more cowardly ones followers, we compared them to stinged and stingless drones, respectively. That's right. Now, these two groups cause problems in any constitution, just as phlegm and bile do in the body, and it's against them that the good doctor and lawgiver of a city must take advanced precautions. First, to prevent their presence, and second, to cut them out of the hive as quickly as possible, cells and all, if they should happen to be present. Yes, by God, he must cut them out altogether. Then let's take up the question in the following way, so that we can see what we want more clearly. In what way? Let's divide a democratic city into three parts in theory, this being the way that it is in fact divided. One part is this class of idlers that grows here no less than in an oligarchy because of the general permissiveness. So it does. But it is far fiercer in democracy than in the other. How so? In an oligarchy, it is fierce because it's disdained, because since it is prevented from having a share in ruling, it doesn't get any exercise and doesn't become vigorous. In a democracy, however, with a few exceptions, this class is the dominant one. Its fiercest members do all the talking and acting, while the rest settle near the speaker's platform and buzz and refuse to tolerate the opposition of another speaker. So that under a democratic constitution, with the few exceptions I referred to before, this class manages everything. That's right. Then there's a second class that always distinguishes itself from the majority of people. Which is that? When everybody is trying to make money, those who are naturally most organized generally become the wealthiest. Probably so. Then they would provide the most honey for the drones and the honey that is most easily extractable by them. Yes, for how could anyone extract it from those who have very little? Then I suppose that these rich people are called drone fodder. Something like that. The people, those who work with their own hands, are the third class. They take no part in politics and have few possessions, but when they are assembled, they are the largest or most powerful class in a democracy. They are. But they aren't willing to assemble often unless they get a share of the honey. And they always do get a share, though the leaders, in taking the wealth of the rich and distributing it to the people, keep the greater part for themselves. Yes, that is the way the people get their share. And I suppose that those whose wealth is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people and doing whatever else they can. Of course. And they're accused by the drones of plotting against the people and of being oligarchs, even if they have no desire for revolution at all. That's right. So in the end, when they see people trying to harm them, they truly do become oligarchs and embrace oligarchy's evils, whether they want to or not. But neither does this group do these neither group does these things willingly. Rather, the people act as they do because they are ignorant and deceived by the drones, and the rich act as they do because they are driven to it by the stinging of those same drones. Absolutely. And there are impeachment, judgments, and trials on both sides. That's right. Now, aren't the people always in the habit of setting up one man as their special champion, nurturing him, and making him great? They are, and it's clear that when a tyrant arises, this special leadership is the sole root from which he sprouts. It is. What is the beginning of the transformation from leader of the people to tyrant? Isn't it clear that it happens when the leader begins to behave like the man in the story told about the temple of the Lycaean Zeus in Arcadia? What story is that? That anyone who tastes the one piece of human innards that's chopped up with those of other sacrificial victims must inevitably become a wolf. Haven't you heard that story? I have. Then doesn't the same happen with a leader of the people who dominates a docile mob and doesn't restrain himself from spilling kindred blood? He brings someone to trial on false charges and murders him, as tyrants often do. And, by thus blotting out a human life, his impious tongue and lips taste kindred citizen blood. He banishes some, kills others, and drops hints to the people about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. And because of these things, isn't a man like that inevitably fated either to be killed by his enemies or to be transformed from a man into a wolf by becoming a tyrant? It's completely inevitable. He's the one who stirs up civil wars against the rich. He is. And if he's exiled but manages despite his enemies to return, doesn't he come back as a full-fledged tyrant? Clearly. And if these enemies are unable to expel him or to put him to death by accusing him before the city, they plot secretly to kill him. That's usually what happens at least. And all who've reached this stage soon discover the famous request of the tyrant, namely, that the people give him a bodyguard to keep their descendants safe for them. That's right. And the people give it to him, I suppose, because they are afraid for his safety, but aren't worried at all about their own. That's right. And when a wealthy man sees this and is charged with being an enemy of the people because of his wealth, then, as the oracle de Croesus put it, he flees to the bank of the many-publilled Hermus, neither staying put nor being ashamed of his cowardice. He wouldn't get a second chance of being ashamed, that's true, for if he was caught, he'd be executed. He most certainly would. But as for the leader, he doesn't lie on the ground, mighty in his might, but having brought down many others, he stands in the city's chariot, a complete tyrant rather than a leader. What else? Then let's describe the happiness of this man and of the city in which a mortal like him comes to be. Certainly, let's do so. During the first days of his reign, and for some time after, won't he smile and welcome anyone he meets, saying that he's no tyrant, making all sorts of promises, both in public and in private, freeing the people from debt, redistributing the land to them and to his followers, and pretending to be gracious and gentle to all? He'd have to. But I suppose that, when he has dealt with his exiled enemies by making peace with some and destroying others, so that all is quiet on that front, the first thing he does is stir up a war, so that people will continue to feel the need of a leader. Probably so. But also so that they'll become poor through having to pay war taxes, for that way they'll have to concern themselves with their daily needs and be less likely to plot against him. Clearly. Besides, if he suspects some people of having thoughts of freedom and of not favoring his rule, can't he find a pretext for putting them at the mercy of the enemy in order to destroy them? And for all these reasons, isn't it necessary for a tyrant to be always stirring up war? It is. And because of this, isn't he all the more readily hated by the citizens? Of course. Moreover, don't the bravest of those who help to establish his tyranny and who hold positions of power within it speak freely to each other and to him, criticizing what's happening? They probably do. Then the tyrant will have to do away with all of them if he intends to rule, until he's left with neither friend nor enemy of any worth. Clearly. He must therefore keep a sharp lookout for anyone who is brave, large-minded, knowledgeable, or rich. And so happy is he that he must be the enemy of them all whenever he wants to be or not, and plot against them until he has purged them from the city. That's a fine sort of purge. Yes, for it's the opposite of the one the doctor performs on the body. They draw off the worst and leave the best, but he does just the opposite. Yet I expect he'll have to do this if he's really going to rule. It's a blessedly happy necessity he's bound by, since it requires him either to live with the inferior majority, even though they hate him, or not live at all. Yet that's exactly his condition. And won't he need a larger and more loyal bodyguard the more his actions make the citizens hate him? Of course. And who will these trustworthy people be? Where will he get them from? They'll come swarming of their own accord, if he pays them. Drones, by the dog, all manner of foreign drones. That's what I think you're talking about. You're right. But what about in the city itself? Wouldn't he be willing to what? To deprive citizens of their slaves by freeing them and listing them to his bodyguard? He certainly would, since they'd be likely to prove most loyal to him. What a blessedly happy sort of fellow you make the tyrant out to be, if these are the sorts of people he employs as friends and loyal followers after he's done away with the earlier ones. Nonetheless, they're the sort he employs. And with these companions and new citizens admire and associate with him, while the decent people hate and avoid him. Of course. It isn't for nothing, then, that the tragedy in general has the reputation of being wise, and that Euripides is thought to be outstandingly so. Why is that? Because among other shrewd things, he said that tyrants are wise who associate with the wise. And by the wise, he clearly means the sort of people that we've seen to be the tyrant's associates. Yes, and he and the other poets eulogize tyranny as godlike and say lots of other such things about it. Then surely, since the tragic poets are wise, they'll forgive us and those whose constitutions resemble ours, if we don't admit them into our city, since they praise tyranny. I suppose that the more sophisticated among them will. And I suppose that they go around to other cities, draw crowds, hire people with fine, big, persuasive voices, and lead their constitutions to tyranny and democracy. They do indeed. And besides this, they receive wages and honors, especially, as one might expect, from the tyrants and in second place, from the democracies. But the higher they go on the ascending scale of constitutions, the more their honor falls off, as if unable to keep up with them for lack of breath. Absolutely. But we digress. So let's return to that fine, numerous, diverse, and ever-changing bodyguard of the tyrant and explain how he'll pay for it. Clearly, if there are sacred treasuries in the city, he'll use them for as long as they last, as well as the property of the people he has destroyed, thus requiring smaller taxes from the people. What about when these give out? Clearly, both he and his fellow revelers, his companions male or female, will have to feed off his father's estate. I understand. You mean that the people, who fathered the tyrant, will have to feed him and his companions? They'll be forced to do so. And what would you have to say about this? What if the people get angry and say, first, that it isn't just for a grown-up son to be fed by his father, but, on the contrary, for the father to be fed by his son? Second, that they didn't father him and establish him in power, so that when he becomes strong, they'd be enslaved to their own slave and have to feed both him and his slaves along with other assorted rabble? But because they hoped that, with him as their leader, they'd be free from the rich and so-called fine and good people in the city. Third, that they therefore order him and his companions to leave the city, just as the father might drive his son and his troublesome fellow revelers from his house. Then, by God, the people will come to know what kind of creature they have fathered, welcomed, and made strong, and that they are the weaker trying to drive out the stronger. What do you mean? Will the tyrant dare to use violence against his father, or to hit him if he doesn't obey? Yes, once he's taken away his father's weapons. You mean that the tyrant is a parasite and a harsh nurse of old age, that his rule has become an acknowledged tyranny at last, and that, as the saying goes, by trying to avoid the frying pan of enslavement to free men, the people have fallen into the fire of having slaves as their masters, that in the place of the great but inappropriate freedom they enjoyed under democracy, they have put upon themselves the harshest and most bitter slavery to slaves. That's exactly what I mean. Well, then, aren't we justified in saying that we've adequately described how tyranny evolves from democracy and what it's like when it has come into being? We certainly are, he said.